Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Embracing Anticipatory Grief, A Path to Healing. A couple of things. My name is Jasmine Victor. I'm the Director of Education here at Alzheimer's Orange County. The Zoom webinar, you will be automatically muted. You will not have access to share your video, but we do have a Q&A and chat options for you. We'll be answering all of your questions at the end, but feel free to, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jasmine. Good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Castro, and I'm accompanied today with my colleague, Tiers Kaysen. We're both Masters of Social Work students here at Alzheimer's Orange County. And, before we start, we want to just express gratitude and thanks to the wonderful team here at Alzheimer's OC for their continued support and just helping making this webinar possible. So thank you so much. Now, today we're going to be presenting on a very sensitive topic, but feel that it is very important to discuss, and that is anticipatory grief. So we are aware that this topic may be too heavy for most, and just wanted to address that we want you to feel free to take breaks throughout the webinar when needed. The point of this webinar is to educate and make aware of the grief that can occur in various different ways and have impacts on a person's well-being. Hopefully by the end of the webinar, we can hope to provide information on resources and support for care partners and staff of Alzheimer's Orange County to share with others who may be experiencing anticipatory grief. At the end of the webinar, we do have a short survey that we would greatly appreciate everyone to fill out. So we also have, and pleased to have a wonderful guest speaker, Carol, who will present her journey as a care partner through the process of grief. So I will pass it on to Tiers, who will explain what anticipatory grief is.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. As Juan mentioned, my name is Tiers Kaysen. I am a second-year MSW student, and I am an intern here at Alzheimer's Orange County. So Juan and I wanted to begin our webinar this morning by defining what anticipatory grief is. So throughout the research in the literature, anticipatory grief is defined as feelings of grief occurring before an impending loss. So we will be discussing anticipatory grief through the lens of memory cognitive impairment this morning, dementia or Alzheimer's. So we discuss anticipatory grief in this instance. For many caregivers, anticipatory grief can begin at diagnosis. So we see this happening maybe due to the loss of future plans an individual had for their loved one, not being able to carry out the future they once envisioned, which is where anticipatory grief can play in. So currently, and unfortunately, there is a lack of research regarding the topic of anticipatory grief and how it impacts throughout the caregiving process. So we do know some short-term implications of caregiving for the caregiver. This can look like impacting psychological well-being, emotional well-being, and also physical implications that can take place throughout the long-term caregiving process. So as we discuss grief throughout this webinar today, Juan and I really want to highlight that all grief does not have to be negative. I know that sounds maybe a little silly, but looking at grief, it can have positive implications. It can make a relationship change and flourish throughout that transitioning period. I think throughout society and maybe everything we hear regarding grief can be negative. But as we will discuss later as well, grief can be playfulness. It can be invention, such as inventing a new relationship with our loved one and really finding new things to appreciate throughout this process. And we really want to emphasize there is no one right way to experience grief. So each individual throughout their lifetime will experience, whether it be anticipatory grief or pre-death grief, they will have those experiences. And so we want to be respectful and mindful of how each individual chooses to grieve throughout this process. So for the next portion of our webinar, we would like to invite our speaker, Carol, to discuss her caregiving journey and how she has experienced anticipatory grief throughout her journey. So Carol, I will hand it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Tears. Well, I was married to my husband for 35 years, or we were together for 35 years. And the last 6 years of our journey together involved a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment. He was, from the time we were married, though, he was older than I by 14 years. So we always kind of anticipated that unless I got hit by a bus or got some terminal illness, he would probably predecease me. So we were really appreciated the time we had together, and he was always very caring and thoughtful of our future. And from the very beginning, we planned for when I would be alone. So for that, I was very grateful. He was diagnosed, when he passed, he was 90, just short of 92 years old. And he was diagnosed at 85. And up until that time, we had a wonderful life together. And we were very active, and I was not terribly stressed over the fact that the diagnosis. I was raised in a family of elderly. My parents were elderly. My aunts and uncles were elderly. I also worked with seniors. So I kind of regarded it as normal aging. And I determined that we would stay as active and keep his mind as alert as possible. One of the things that really struck me, though, was his decline, which really hurt, watching him trying to do things that it was at one time had been very easy for him to do. Then it became difficult. Our roles changed. I had to drive him everywhere. I had to, taking over things around the house, the chores that he normally did. But we found things that he was able to do that helped him feel like he was still a part of our family life. He did the dishes every night. He helped me clean the shower after a shower was taken, and he felt like he was participating. One of the things that I try to do, and I noticed a lot of people in the care, in the support groups that I attended, were tried, instead of enjoying the person that he had become, or our partner had become, we tried to fix them. And once I learned to accept the fact that he was declining and I could enjoy him where he was, it made life a lot easier and a lot better. And you can't fix them. You have to join their reality, and that way it makes it so much easier to cope. He passed away not from his cognitive impairment. His heart failed, and the last 6 months of his life. We were locked up because of COVID. And at this point, in retrospect, I see that as a blessing, a real blessing, because we were able to spend quality time together and enjoy each other. We took advantage of all of the opportunities that Alzheimer's Orange County offered us, and it was it certainly helped us cope. And when and after he passed, I continued to participate in the Zoom activities. There weren't live activities at that time, but at least I could see familiar faces, and that helped me through my grief process tremendously. As far as humor being a part of our lives, we could joke about it not being able to remember things, and I sometimes I think one of the errors I made was sometimes using the term remember this or remember that, and then I would feel sad because you didn't. But anyway, I have to thank Alzheimer's Orange County for all of the support groups and the activities and all the wonderful opportunities we had to feel normal. And I encourage anybody out there to take advantage of what's available. And I think that's it, unless, yeah.
That was great. Thank you so much, Carol, for being here with us and being open and honest about your journey with your partner. If it's okay with you, if we do have questions regarding your story, is it okay if we send them to you later to answer those questions if some of our members have specific questions for you?
Absolutely. Sure.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much, Carol, for being with us.
You're welcome. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, so for the next portion of our webinar, we are going to be discussing dementia grief. So we wanted to highlight dementia grief here this morning and how it overlaps with anticipatory grief. So dementia grief may vary from other types of grief that we see due to the loved one still being present with us. And although they are still present, we may be seeing loss of functionings that they previously had, unable to engage in hobbies they once enjoyed, or having trouble, like Carol's story did highlight, recalling fond memories, and it's hard to come back to that. So dementia grief can occur as a response to compounded losses of varying magnitude throughout the dementia progression. So like I mentioned a little bit previously, watching our loved one not be able to perform to the same extent they once did prior to the diagnosis. Carol gave a great example of watching her partner struggle to go up the stairs, and he once did not have that type of issue. So really, the caregiver is responsible for watching these types of decline, which brings about new feelings of grief throughout the process. So grief can be a continuous emotion when caring for a loved one with a memory cognitive impairment, and this can be due to the progressive nature of the disease. And many times the caregiver may have to fill in the gaps that are now present and care for their loved ones in areas where they are no longer able to function. Oftentimes for a caregiver, it can feel like they are losing the person already when they are still present with us, which encompasses dementia grief and some feelings associated with that grief.
Okay. As many of you guys may be aware of, a famous psychiatrist by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a pioneer in the near-death studies. During her studies, she developed the theory of the 5 stages of grief. This theory at the time really only applied to individuals nearing death. So it was later adapted into all forms of grief. And so the Kubler-Ross model was definitely controversial, as the stages indicated that you needed to move from one stage to another in a linear process. And as we know today, that of course is not true, as many individuals experience grief much differently from others. So the stages that I want to go over are the 5 stages here: the denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And how the feelings or thoughts may arise for care partners. So denial, you may have thoughts of hoping that the person may not feel ill, or expecting that the person to get better, convincing yourself that the person has not changed, or attempting to normalize the problematic behaviors. And then anger, feeling frustrated with either the person that you're caring for or the disease, resenting the demands of the caregiver role. Also resenting family members who cannot or will not help provide care, and which may lead to feeling abandonment. Bargaining, you have, which is closely associated with feeling guilt, having unrealistic expectations, with thoughts like, I should have done this, or I must do everything for this person, or I must visit them every day. So in addition to feeling bad because you are still able to enjoy life, but feel that you shouldn't. Feelings that you have failed if, for example, you cannot care for the person at this time. And moving on to depression. It's like feeling overwhelmed, crying frequently. You have also withdrawing from social activities or needing to connect more frequently with others, in addition to withholding your emotions, displaying them more openly than usual. And lastly is acceptance, learning to live in the moment, understanding how the grieving process affected your life, appreciating the personal growth that comes from this process. And like what was said earlier, was finding the sense of humor, and asking for assistance and help from others. Now, this model started to put emphasis on counseling for families and loved ones. And Kubler-Ross suggested that death be a normal stage of life, and offered us strategies for helping patients and their families to negotiate these stages/cycles. And as time and research started to evolve, a person by the name of David Kessler worked closely with Kubler-Ross to develop the 6th stage of grief. As David Kessler put it, who is a famous author and an expert in grieving, put that there had to be more than just acceptance, as none of these stages provided a sense of closure. So finding meaning is not about learning to get over it. It's about learning to remember those that either you have lost or are losing with more love than pain. Oh, sorry. Kessler believed that we have to learn to move forward in ways that honor the person. As Kubler-Ross stated earlier, well, what I stated earlier with as far as the death be considered a normal stage of life, Kessler suggested that grief is also a normal stage of life. As modern society makes it difficult to process this grief in a very rapidly way. And as we know that individuals can be stuck in some of these stages for long periods of time, whether it's hours, days, months, or even years.
Great job. Thank you so much, Juan. So for the next portion of our webinar, Juan and I wanted to show a quick video clip of Anderson Cooper. For those of you who don't know, Anderson Cooper has a wonderful podcast that we will also discuss later throughout the webinar. But Anderson Cooper does have an episode on anticipatory grief and his experience with anticipatory grief. So throughout the video, he will be talking about some of his feelings associated with watching his nanny, May, May who had dementia decline and what that anticipatory grief process was like for him. So if any questions arise during the video, please feel free to put them in the Q&A in the chat box, and we will get to those at the end of the webinar.
On this week's episode of the podcast, All There Is with Anderson Cooper, Anderson looks at anticipatory grief and talks about the process of slowly losing his beloved nanny, May McClendon, to Alzheimer's disease.
Watching her decline, watching all the dreams I'd had of giving her a house or having her live with me when I had kids one day, watching all that disappear was like nothing I'd ever experienced. It was a different kind of grief, different than my mom, different than my dad, different than my brother. After a time, May stopped speaking words. When I'd visit, she still knew who I was, but she'd open her mouth and the only sound that came out was a single note, like she was singing. Ah, ah.
And Anderson is with us now, along with Sebastian, who we're so happy to have him come back again with us. Hi, buddy. Anderson, it's so moving. And I know so many people who have lost someone slowly like this are going to appreciate you giving voice to this process for them. Can you talk to us a little bit more about this concept of anticipatory grief?
Yeah, I actually had never heard the term before, and a filmmaker named Kirsten Johnson, who I interview in this episode of the podcast, she's the one who mentioned it in an incredible film she did called Dick Johnson is Dead, about her father. She lost her mom to Alzheimer's in 2007. Her father now struggles with dementia. We actually talked to him during the interview as well. But it's this idea, and I think it's anybody who's lost a loved one to dementia or Alzheimer's who's dealing with that, or any terminal illness. It's the idea of seeing the gradual decline, the disappearance of somebody before your eyes, and it's that anticipating what is to come. It's not going to necessarily get any better. It's going to be this drawn out thing. And so you're already anticipating their death. You're anticipating being without them in your life, and yet they're still there in front of you. It's a particular kind of grief. And it's obviously very, very difficult to deal with. And it's nice, when people talk about it, and to know that you are not the first person who's gone down this road.
I never heard of that concept either until you mentioned it just now. Sort of like a horror movie where it's not the loud noise that's the worst. It's knowing that it's going to come, that I think tears you up the most inside. We have a clip of your conversation with that filmmaker, Kirsten Johnson. Let's listen.
One of the classic stories I tell is him waking up in the middle of the night, extremely worried that a patient is downstairs, and I can't convince him logically that the patient is not there. So then I go downstairs with him. Then what happens? He looks around. He's like, there's no patient. And he's like, oh, you were right. And then he says, it must be incredibly difficult to watch your father lose his mind.
Wow. So he's had the self-awareness of what was happening to him.
Yes, that would go in and out. But when it was in, it's like a knife in your heart.
Wow. And Anderson, you said one of the reasons she was so great to talk to is she talked to you about the importance of being able to get to know someone even after they die. What does she mean by that?
Yeah, this is a concept to me which kind of blew my mind, and I just think it's so important, and it can give hope to so many people. It's this idea that your relationship, death is not the end of your relationship with that person. And I know maybe that sounds like too sort of out there, but when you think about it, you will continue to have a relationship with the person who's died. I continue to have a relationship with May McClendon, this nanny I had for 15 years, who was really a mother to me, as close to me as my mom and my dad. And I stayed involved in her life for the rest of her life, even after she no longer was my nanny. But my relationship with her changes. Having children, having my kids, I understand May in a different way than I did before. I know what she was doing when she was caring for me. I see her in a different way. And Kirsten was talking about that. And I think that's a really important idea, that you can get to know somebody even after they're gone. You can get to know them in a deeper way by reading something that they wrote or going through their things, or as you evolve, you know, as I become a 55-year-old man, I can better understand what my mom went through when she lost her husband, my dad, when she was 50, or when, you know, when I can understand things as a parent about my parents that I didn't understand before. So even that they're no longer present, they are still very present in your life, and your relationship with them evolves. And to me, that's a really hopeful thing, because it means that that love that you have, that bond that you have, it's obviously different and you wish they were there, but it evolves, and you can still talk to them and have a relationship with them and understand them in a new and deeper way.
Anderson, what kind of reaction have you been getting to this incredible series?
Yeah, it's been really extraordinary. I mean, it's been overwhelming. I've received, I can't tell you how many thousands of direct messages from people on Instagram, which is sort of generally the way I communicate on social media at all. And it's just been incredibly deep messages of people telling me about the losses they've experienced and how they've dealt with it, and what they're taking from the podcast and ideas for the podcast. And it's just, there is an ocean of loss and an ocean of grief. This is the most universal of human experiences. Someone DM'd me today saying, like, we all talk about birth and talk about that freely. We don't talk about end of life. We don't talk about death and loss as freely. And I think this is a conversation a lot of people would like to have, because not having it doesn't make it go away. Not having it only makes you feel just more lonely and isolated, as I have felt for a long time.
So true. It is so important what you're doing, Anderson, and I'm so glad that we get to talk about this with you this morning. Thank you so much for sharing some time with us.
My pleasure.
And
Sure, my
Sebastian,
pleasure.
as always. See you later, bud. And be sure to, he's so cool about this always. You can be sure to check out the latest episode of All There Is with Anderson Cooper, available now wherever you get your podcasts, or you can just scan the QR code on your screen, I'll give you a second, with your phone to find the podcast.
All right. So as we saw through the video, Anderson discusses his experience with anticipatory grief and relating to the diagnosis of dementia in his nanny, May. So as Anderson described, May cared for Anderson from birth to adolescence. She stopped working for Anderson's family when he was approximately 15. But although she no longer worked for his family, they still remained very close. As Anderson described, she was like a second mother to him. They had all these great life experiences together. And so throughout adulthood, Anderson remained very close to May. They taught very frequently and they traveled together. And throughout the podcast episode, Anderson really highlights some of his fondest memories with May and the ways that they were able to continue connecting and building that relationship throughout her diagnosis. So at the bottom of your screen in the right-hand corner, we do have the name of the podcast episode. So it's going to be episode 5, which is titled Anticipatory Grief. And like discussed, Anderson's name of podcast is All There Is. I would suggest anyone who is interested listening to the episode. It is a very heavy episode, but I think Anderson touches on a lot of really good principles discussing anticipatory grief, and also, like he mentioned throughout the video, really normalizing these feelings of anticipatory grief, since it isn't talked about as much or even well known than the typical type of grief we all think of, which is probably after someone has passed. So throughout the episode as well, Anderson really highlights the importance of his relationship with May and how it shaped him as a person. And as you guys saw, now as a father, and how he is also grieving and was grieving while May was still with us. The thought that she was not going to be here for when he did have his children, when he did decide to become a father. So grieving those occurrences that have not happened yet, and also really just highlighting the relationship and how it's still present, and how May is still very much living through him, and the way he continues to influence Anderson. So just a little bit more information regarding what was discussed throughout the podcast episode. So May's health began to decline around the age of 80. So as Anderson is discussing throughout the video that we saw, the life he envisioned for her, and he was wanting to take care of May through her old age, financially wanting to provide her with comprehensive care for whatever she might need. He also discussed wanting to buy a house next to his, and the importance of having May be a part of raising his own children and as he was going into adulthood and things like that. So Anderson does discuss that although the relationship between himself and May changed as the disease progressed, it was still a positive relationship. There were still a lot of fond memories that were felt between May and Anderson. And up until the later stages of her disease, May frequently spoke about her son, Anderson. Anderson discusses how throughout her facility, May spoke of Anderson and referred to him as his son, or as her son, and had a lot of pictures and cards from Anderson, and was very willing to talk about Anderson to whoever would listen. So they did play some of this quote throughout the video, but I felt it was important to highlight here in the webinar as well. So Anderson said, watching her decline, watching all the things I wanted disappear was like nothing I have ever experienced. It was a different kind of grief. So I wanted to include this quote because I felt like this quote in and of itself really encompasses the definition of anticipatory grief and some of the feelings and the emotions that we can have associated with anticipatory grief. And as Anderson mentioned throughout the video, he does go more in depth throughout the podcast episode. Unfortunately, he has had a lot of loss throughout his life thus far. And because of that, losing his mother, his father, and his brother, all for different causes. But he mentioned how the grief that was associated with the diagnosis of dementia and the decline that came was harder than any other loss he had experienced. All right, so we are now going to discuss the 6 R's. So the 6 R's is a principle that is related to grieving and loss, but we can also think of it as something that brings about transition and change, and kind of reframing our thoughts of grieving and also the diagnosis of memory cognitive impairment. So the first R we have here is recognizing the loss. So this can look like, as Anderson discussed, recognizing the future plans that we now have lost, the future we envision for our loved one, and now not being able to carry out the specific plans we were hoping to. So recognizing the loss and change of relationship. Reacting to the separation, so reacting to some relationship dynamics that now may be changing between you and your loved one with memory cognitive impairment, looking at maybe the communication needs to be adapted, maybe some activities take a little longer than they did before. So being able to cope through those emotions of grief and anticipating the separation that may come. So recollecting and re-experiencing the relationship. So this was really highlighted throughout the podcast episode and also throughout the video. As Anderson mentioned, he interviewed a filmmaker named Kristen Johnson, and she really highlights re-experiencing the relationship, really wanting to finding new meaning throughout the relationship. So as she discusses, it's never too late to get to know someone differently or deeply. So by re-experiencing the relationship, we can find new connections with our loved one. We can make new memories and still experience a deep bond, but maybe in a different way than we have come to know. So relinquishing old attachments, just being sure or being aware of no longer trying to hold on to the things that may not be as attainable as prior to the diagnosis, and now maybe altering our future plans that we have for our loved one, and it can still be a positive connotation to it. So readjusting to a new world. This is really a key principle with the diagnosis of dementia and Alzheimer's. Our loved one who may have the memory cognitive impairment is now probably in a new reality than we are. So having to adjust to that reality being aware of the environment, how might it feel to them? How can we adjust the environment to ensure they're comfortable? How can our communication change a little bit just to ensure that the individual is comfortable and we're still able to communicate properly? And then reinvesting emotionally. So like we've kind of discussed so far, being able to build a deeper connection with our loved one, whether it be different than the one we had prior, and really going in and still knowing that an emotional bond can exist, even though some things might be changing. So before we start the next section of our webinar, Juan and I thought this might be a good halfway point to kind of take a breath and recenter ourselves before we continue. So if everyone feels comfortable, I would invite you to engage in a quick deep breathing exercise with me. We're just going to take 2 deep breaths and close our eyes, and then we will continue with the webinar. So if you feel comfortable closing your eyes, breathing in deep through your nose, and out through your mouth. And one more time, breathing in deep through your nose and out through your mouth. And we will now continue to the next segment of our webinar. So Juan, take it away.
Thanks for that, Tiers. All right, so I will be discussing about the impacts on caregiver role. So research findings indicate that approximately 12.5 to 38.5% of caregivers experience pre-death symptoms. So what are pre-death symptoms? Well, they've been identified as having separation anxiety, anticipating future absence, the denial, and relational losses. As you can see, they're very similar to the process of anticipatory grief. So research suggests that due to the emotions associated with the impending loss, that grief usually often begins after diagnosis is received. Research also suggests that due to the prolonged periods of grief that someone undergoes, that caregivers are more prone to experience psychological distress while caregiving, impacting health and overall well-being, which then heightens psychological distress, which can lead to caregivers feeling burnt out, feelings of burden to others when asking for help or assistance. And here's a quote here that I wanted to share with you that we found was kind of like sums up what we're discussing here, that it is so important as a caregiver not to become so enmeshed in the role that you lose yourself. It's neither good for you or your loved one.
All right, so now we're going to be discussing the implications of caregiving. So throughout the research that we know on caregiving and the implications, there isn't too much out there as of now on the long trajectory of dementia and its progressive nature, which is associated with a cumulative decline. So it can inevitably, unfortunately, have negative consequences for informal caregivers. So because of this, caregivers can feel heightened psychological distress, emotional distress, and also it can affect their physical well-being. So caregivers who lack support oftentimes experience higher levels of anticipatory grief and caregiver burden. So we will really highlight the importance of having a support network of individuals who you can lean on and discuss the frustrations of caregiving and how more than often than not, it is a full-time job. So for the caregiver, it's vital to have those people, whether it be joining a support group and having a group of individuals who are able to relate to you or maybe provide possible solutions to maybe a behavioral issue that your loved one is having. So by having that support, it has a lot of positive implications for the caregiver. So the implications of long-term caregiving has yet to be extensively studied and recognized concerning dementia, but we do and we will talk about some of the research that discusses some of the short-term implications from what we know. So long-term caregiving is correlated with higher instances of personal sacrifice for the caregiver. So in terms of personal sacrifice, this can look like the caregiver not having an appropriate amount of time to engage in activities they once liked, maybe such as going walking around their neighborhood with their dog, or having coffee with their friends, or being able to go to Zumba class. So because of caregiving, an individual may not have the time that they did have prior to the diagnosis to engage in things just for themselves. We also may see an increase in burden of being worried about leaving their loved one unattended for long periods of time, especially throughout the later stages of the disease. And worry is a big one that is seen throughout caregiving and throughout the disease process. So worrying that maybe the caregiver is not providing comprehensive care to their loved one, or am I doing enough? Is there something I should be doing? How do I manage this behavior? So worry is a reoccurring theme that we often see throughout long-term caregiving. And lastly, we have decreased socialization. So I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but the individual caregiver not having enough time to engage in socialization, whether it be going and seeing adult children, maybe grandchildren, or even friends and family, or your community where you live. So because of decreased socialization, sometimes we can see an increase in social isolation, which can bring about negative consequences for both the caregiver and the person with dementia. So just really trying to maintain social contacts, whether it be through Zoom and Zooming some of your friends to kind of catch up on the week, or calling your friend or your loved one to be able to have that outlet to discuss, maybe not even caregiving, but just to get a break. So research studying the influence of anticipatory grief on caregivers concluded that throughout the later stages of dementia, many caregivers are not allocated the necessary support to cope with feelings of grief. So this can kind of relate to the first point on this slide, discussing when an individual more often than not takes on the role of a full-time caregiver, they're no longer able to have the respite care that is needed to cope with those feelings of grief. And throughout the later stages of the disease, an individual may lose necessary functioning. So where the individual with the memory cognitive impairment may be lacking, the caregiver may kind of feel pressure to step in and to fill those gaps.
All right, next I will be discussing support for caregivers. Therapists conveyed how caregivers have the ability to recognize and express, in addition to accept, the emotions such as grief, sadness, loneliness, desperation, and anger, while maintaining their daily functioning as a caregiver. And so with these support networks, ensure that individuals was able to process these griefs by utilizing therapy/grief counselors. As stated before, grief comes in various forms, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you have to lose someone in order to access these supports. And so there are grief support groups that help build social isolation. It helps normalize and validate individuals who are going through this process, in addition to also engaging in self-care, finding things that you enjoy doing, hobbies, like Tyr said, going out with your friends and enjoying time, respite, and additionally having time for sleep. And in addition to asking for help, we want to highlight that there is no shame in asking for assistance. And lastly is reframing the role as a caregiver, and changing the perspective helps with managing the process of grief. Now, here are some caregiver resources that we came across that we seemed helpful. There is the 36-hour day, which helps features everything from the causes of dementia to managing its early stages, in addition to giving advice on caring for those in the later stages of the disease. In addition to practical advice for avoiding caregiver burnout, plus tips for when tips on how to get additional help. Creating Moments of Joy by Jolene Brackley. She pretty much, from this thing, we received that although memories may fade, the feelings of the moment still linger. So it's a really good source of material that could be seemed beneficial as far as our support groups, and of course the All There Is with Anderson Cooper podcast. Through the YouTube that we showed, you can access that podcast through the QR code, or you can get it through any podcast source that you've utilized in the past.
As we wrap up our webinar today, Juan and I kind of wanted to highlight some different ways that joy can be felt and experienced while caregiving. I know caregiving is a very emotionally taxing job and an exhausting job, but kind of trying to highlight the ways that we can find joy during this process. So first, we discuss focusing on the activities your loved one can still enjoy and actively engage in. This can look like maybe baking together, gardening, doing laundry, maybe painting, activities like that can be done with the caregiver as well as the individual with the memory cognitive impairment. And little activities like this can really allow us to be present in the moment with our loved one and to build positive memories with them. So identify new ways to connect and redefine your relationship with your loved one. We've kind of highlighted this principle throughout the webinar thus far, but really trying to find things that you and your loved one can actively engage in together, and being able to really still build that emotional bond, even though the connection and relationship may be transitioning or changing. So savoring the little and the big moments. This can be something as simple as baking together and really having that time together, or something for big moments, maybe the holidays together and really remembering those holidays. And Anderson Cooper in his podcast brings about a great principle to be used is recording a lot of your loved one, or having voice recordings or visual video recordings of the little and big moments, just something for the caregiver to look back on and recall those positive memories throughout this process. Utilizing your support system. Juan and I have really emphasized this principle throughout the webinar, having those people that you can call during maybe you're having a bad day, or just to talk about the stress of being a caregiver. And I think this is where, you know, a support group would really help, just in terms of having that network of people to discuss and have someone to be able to relate to what you may be experiencing, or maybe experience something similar but not the same. So practicing gratitude. So research actually shows that practicing gratitude is associated with greater happiness. So something I personally like to do at the beginning of the day, as I'm getting out of bed or getting ready for my day, practicing my gratitude by thinking to myself, what am I thankful for? What is going well in my life? Where, you know, what am I doing to the best of my ability? And I think along with practicing gratitude, we can also think of positive affirmations. So just, this is something that can take as little as a minute or 30 seconds, but telling myself, I am worthy, I am strong. For a caregiver, I am doing the best I can. I am caring for my loved one is loved. So really emphasizing those things that we're doing well and practicing that gratitude. And this will not only help the caregiver's emotional well-being, but also the care that is given to the individual with the memory cognitive impairment. So lastly, we have identify activities that bring you joy, logging them in a joyful journal. So also a really good activity that can be done with the loved one and the caregiver can be something such as looking at old photographs. You and the individual can discuss who is in the photo, when was it taken, what did it feel like to be there at the photo. And I think this is a really good activity for both parties, and something that a lot of individuals really enjoy. So logging the activities in the joyful journal can be kept in someone's bedside or in a drawer for the caregiver to look back on when maybe it's been a more challenging day or difficult day, but still remembering the positive moments that have occurred and the love that is still present in the relationship.
Okay. In summary, we just wanted to just highlight that the normalizing the experience of all emotions throughout the process of this grief, encouraging the use of your support systems, acknowledging the demands of being a caregiver, in addition to acknowledging distress and emotions prior to loss. And we also want to understand that some people may not understand that you're grieving. So most people think that happens when someone dies, as stated earlier. They may not know that it is possible to grieve deeply for someone, especially with a diagnosis of dementia or some form of it. We also want you to accept this yourself. Think about what you expect from yourself. Is it realistic? Learn to accept things that are beyond your control and make reasonable decisions about the things that you can control. In addition to taking care of yourself, the best thing that you can do for a person you are caring for is to stay healthy. This includes taking care of your physical, mental, and emotional well-being. Creating a balance in your life. Do things that you enjoy and that brings comfort, and give yourself time to rest. Ask for help when you need it. And lastly is accept the help that is offered.
So we just wanted to provide you guys with some resources by Alzheimer's Orange County, as well as other agencies throughout Orange County that can assist with the caregiving process. So first, find a support group. So for Alzheimer's Orange County, we do provide in-person and Zoom virtual support groups throughout Orange County. All our support groups are listed on our website, and on the website, you will be able to see the days and the times that the support group occurs. And also we do have specialized support groups. So I would encourage you guys to maybe take a look and see if you feel like a support group is appropriate for you. We also have the Caregiver Resource Center. So the Caregiver Resource Center is a great tool that each caregiver should be aware of. They have a lot of comprehensive resources and services. There's a couple just listed on this slide here. They do offer individual counseling for caregivers. If an individual is more interested in that than a support group kind of setting. They also do have a lot of education and training, a lot of good resources maybe pertaining to communication, a certain behavior, and being able to provide resources that way. Their website is at the bottom of the slide here. It's going to be www.caregiver.oc.org. Okay, so lastly, we do have some of our resources here at Alzheimer's Orange County. We have our helpline number listed. Juan and I are both interns at our helpline. If you guys have any questions regarding caregiving, maybe you need assistance or you would like to meet in person with one of our social workers, the helpline is a great place to start, and we would be more than happy to assist you along with the rest of our social workers at the helpline. We also have a Facebook page. So by liking us on Facebook, you'll be able to see the events that are occurring or some of our recorded webinars that you can view at your own pace and when you have time. Lastly, our website. So our website has a lot of great resources in terms of our education calendar, which has all of our events and webinars and in-person talks included in the education calendar. It also has some of our pre-recorded webinars that will be available, and also a couple good fact sheets regarding Alzheimer's and dementia. So lastly, we wanted to open up the question and answer in the chat to the participants. If anyone has any questions regarding anything we've discussed today, or maybe a comment, feel free to leave those in the chat box in the Q&A, and Juan and I would be more than happy to answer all your questions to the best of our ability. If we are unsure, we will definitely discuss with our supervisor, and we can get back to you regarding the proper resources or answer to your question.
Thank you so much, Tierce and Juan. That was a great presentation. It looks like there's a couple of comments I wanted to share, but feel free to type in the question and answer, the Q&A little box there at the bottom of your toolbar or the chat box. So first I wanted to bring up something that was mentioned. Was I would be curious or interested in knowing how grieving might be different for someone with a diagnosis in their 60s as opposed to late 80s. I have been married 47 years to my husband who no longer knows me. He is 69 and I am 65. And I'm a full-time caregiver.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. I would say, I don't know if there is a difference. I don't want to say there isn't. Oh, okay. How am I going to answer this? Forgive me. I would say it's dependent on the person. And I know a lot of what we've discussed today with the anticipatory grief is the loss of that future and no longer having the ability to maybe do the things you've planned. I know when Carol spoke with us today, she did talk about how her husband was quite older than her and his diagnosis did come a little later in his life. So maybe that would be a little bit easier in terms of digesting the information and finding appropriate next steps for care for their loved one. Juan, do you have anything to add on to that?
No, you actually hit it spot on. I mean, honestly, it's just really dependent, right, on the situation. Again, all research that we've looked at is like just coming out, and it's still, you know, fairly new. So it's something that we can definitely look out for, and that's a great question. So
Yeah,
thank you
and
for
I
that.
think too, sorry to add one more thing, like for the individual who may be receiving the diagnosis or this situation that they're in, really reaching out for that support early and having that support network as the diagnosis progresses, I think would be one of my top things to you know, maybe address, just so you do have that support and, you know, you are not feeling alone throughout the process.
Very good points. Yes, you know, this topic is new in the research field, but obviously it's, you know, it's something that's always been existing, but we, you know, people weren't exactly aware and studying it, that it was a universal thing, because it is. Let's see. I have one other comment here, if I can find it again. Someone mentions about, you know, that they're caring for their cousin, you know, as a caregiver, and they have their own life to lead. Essentially, they have groups and things, and they like their cousin to help attend and things. But however, you know, it's kind of overwhelming trying to keep your lifestyle and then trying to also care for somebody else as the demands kind of increase. So one thing I did want to kind of mention is, you know, if they're feeling afraid to leave them alone at home, you know, rather than, you know, taking them everywhere that they go. And that's why we have, you know, respite source resources, you know, the Caregiver Resource Center. There's IHSS, in-home supportive services through CalOptima, depending on your insurance, things like that. So there's plenty of resources. Give us a call at the helpline. We can help also with resources, so that, yeah, you don't have to leave your loved one alone, and that, you know, there's someone that I can, you know, trust and support you. Let's see. It's shared here. Great information. Thank you so much for sharing this. So important to have this info available for anyone caring for someone with dementia in any stage as they prepare for the inevitable. Carol gave a very clear picture of the challenge. Finding a support group has been one of my best helps, and participating in all that Alzheimer's OC offers is the most supportive avenue I have had. The Caregiver Resource Center is phenomenal. Yes, thank you for providing that information. You're welcome. Yeah, they're wonderful. Let's see. Yes, family members, you know, that are younger to process, you know, the anticipatory grief. Yeah, it's difficult when there's the early onset, and it's not something, you know, we would, you know, kind of, I guess, as we get older, you know, we think, okay, we're aging, things are going to happen. But when you're, you know, early, young, still young, and then you get a diagnosis, it's a little bit different, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, somebody asked about the Medi-Cal website. I found the name of the site. Okay. Phyllis, I would recommend again calling our helpline. They can help you out with that as well with Medi-Cal and any other services to help you with that. Let's see. I think somebody asked for a copy of the slides. And I think that's everything. I hope I didn't miss anybody. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, it looks like I got everybody. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you for attending. It's been great.
Yeah, and we also have on the next slides Juan and I's contact information, just in case anyone thinks of any last minute questions. Feel free to email us or call us at the helpline. We would be more than happy to help you. And then if everyone could try to fill out the survey, please, it will be coming to you soon. And just so Juan and I are able to use that information. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I hope you found this useful.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.